Hello, Botany. Welcome back. I am Mr. Miller, and this is Room 142. So let us go ahead and actually jump into some content. We're going to dive into our first unit. So botany, once again, is the study of plants. So our first unit is going to be the world of plants. So take out your notes. We're going to learn about the world of plants. So really throughout society, we are surrounded by plants that you might not even think about, but they're all around us, and they play really important roles in allowing us to live and essentially build structures like houses and fulfill different functions. All right, so first let's kind of break down biology into its different branches. There are many, many different branches of biology. So essentially, these are just a couple. So biology, the essence of what it is the study of life. The main branches of it are going to be botany, the study of plants, zoology, the study of animals, and microbiology. So prefix micro means small. So all the small stuff, the study of microorganisms, very tiny living things. So organisms, living things. There are also many other sub-disciplines within these: bacteriology, study of bacteria; mycology, study of fungus; protozoology, study of protozoa; and nematology, nematodes; immunology, the immune system, which is really important and relevant regarding COVID, like how the body's immune system would fight COVID; and zoology, entomology, insects; ichthyology, fish; ornithology, birds; herpetology, reptiles; amphibians, so on and so forth. And then botany also has subdisciplines like agronomy, for example, how do we grow plants, as well as horticulture. All right. So, but before we can really get into, what is botany and what is the world of plants, we need to discuss what makes something living. So this is going to be a review back from biology. You might have talked about the 8 characteristics of life. Depending on who you talk to, there's either about 7 or 8 characteristics. I believe we're going to talk about 7 here, but there are characteristics that makes something living. All right, so we're going to talk about those. So what makes something living versus non-living? So make sure to jot this down. This is going to be very important going forward. All right, so all living beings have a universal genetic code. Now that's either going to be DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, or RNA, ribonucleic acid. So I don't expect you to necessarily memorize those. That's just kind of a common genetic code throughout all the kingdoms of life. So essentially, living beings need a genetic code so they can spread on their traits, their genes, to their offspring from generation to generation. That is why you likely look a little bit like, or a lot like, your parents. Offspring tend to look like their parents for this reason, because of this genetic code, and it is universal. So all living things must have a genetic code. All living things must be able to adapt and evolve. So essentially, what does that mean? We're going to talk, more sporadically about evolution as we go throughout the semester, and that would have been kind of the final unit in biology. So evolution is the change over time of populations, which is a group of living things. So essentially what happens is, over time, in response to the environment, an organism, a living being, has to be able to change its physical traits. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. It's not like it's going to get cold and I'm instantly going to grow a fur coat. Like, that would be pretty weird. It happens over generations and over time. So it takes time, but essentially those adaptations make that living being more well equipped to live in that environment. For example, you could think about a beaver having really waterproof fur. You could think about a number of adaptations, like deer having really long legs so they can run fast and outrun wolves or predators, many different things. All living beings need to be able to respond to stimuli. So stimuli, or a stimulus, is essentially any kind of an action in the environment. So like If a firecracker goes off while I was sitting here at my desk, I would probably jump. I would respond to that stimuli because essentially my adrenaline would get going, and I would enter kind of a fight or flight response, perhaps, because that would be startling. So living things need to be able to respond. Like if a crocodile is coming after you, if you're a bird, you need to be able to fly away and respond and escape that dangerous stimulus. So that is a characteristic of life. Reproduction, all living beings need to be able to make more of themselves. Living beings and species or groups of living beings would not exist anymore if they couldn't do this. Humans wouldn't exist if we as a species couldn't reproduce. So very important. Now, there are individuals within a population that might be sterile or unable to reproduce, but overall, a healthy population needs the majority of their individuals to be able to reproduce. And, like a deer is only going to be at reproductive, maximum for a couple of years. Maybe once the deer is 10 years old, it's not going to be reproducing as much, but it doesn't mean that at all points in their life they need to be able to reproduce. It just means that at some point in their life they needed to be able to reproduce. All right, all living things use energy. So essentially all living things have to be able to break down food and get energy from it. Now, if we think about plants, plants don't eat in the typical way we think about it. Plants are autotrophs or self-feeders. They use photosynthesis to make their own energy from sunlight, but they still use that energy, so they're still living. Plants respond to stimulus. They're gonna turn towards the light. Plants can reproduce via fruit, spores, many different things. And plants also have DNA as well. So I've been using animal examples, but all of these really apply to plants as well. Cellular structure. So all living things must be made of cells. That was Rudolf Virchow was the guy who said that. Essentially, all cells have to come from pre-existing cells. So, and what's a cell? A cell is the most basic unit of life. That's a review from bio. So cellular structure. You may recall that plant cells are kind of boxy. They're more rigid, whereas animal cells more circular, more fluid. So essentially, but all living beings need cellular structure. And then growth and development. So all living beings need to be able to grow. So if we're talking about an infant human, or if we're talking about a baby seedling, like the green beans I have growing in the greenhouse right now, all living things need to be able to grow. All living things don't always grow if they're not in the right conditions. Like if I put those green beans out in the Arctic tundra, they're not going to grow and they're not going to be living for very long. But all living things need the capability under the right circumstances to be able to grow and develop. All right, so given that, here's a pop quiz for you. Shouldn't be too difficult. Which of these two pictured items is living? So go ahead, think about that. We'll talk about it. Okay, and we're back. All right, so which of the pictured items is living? It is, without a doubt, going to be this bur oak tree. It's a beautiful tree. Looks like that one's probably 100 years old or so. We'd have to look at the tree rings to find out. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. So why is the bur oak tree living? Yes. So I kind of had a little bit of fun here. If you chose B, it was probably a joke. I would assume you would all know that A is indeed the living being, but we might need to reevaluate your course selection if B was your choice. All right. So the rock is non-living. It doesn't grow. It doesn't reproduce, contain cells, or use energy. It may have potential energy, or it does have potential energy as it sits atop this hill. Like if you got a great big giant like the Incredible Hulk to give it a push, it would roll down that hill with quite a lot of energy, kinetic energy of movement. But it doesn't metabolize. It doesn't break down energy. You could think about, Mr. Miller, wouldn't the rock reproduce if it got broken into smaller rocks? That's not reproduction. That would be like weathering or erosion. And it doesn't grow, although you might think maybe this rock, maybe other rocks kind of get slammed into it and cemented together and it turns into a bigger rock. Most likely that wouldn't happen, but in order to be living, something must contain all of the characteristics of life. So if something might contain energy, like if this is potential energy, but it can't reproduce, it can't grow, it can't do all the other stuff, then it's not living. A key point here with living beings, I'm going to switch back to this past slide, is when we look at the case study of a virus. So COVID, coronavirus, is a virus, and many people might think that it's alive. However, a virus technically is not alive because it cannot reproduce independent of a host. So the virus, if it were just out on a surface for 24 hours, like the tabletops, and which we wipe down and get rid of it and keep it out of our school, the virus cannot reproduce independent of like a human host or an animal host, like a bat, for example. So it wouldn't be considered living, even though it technically might contain a genetic code, like it has RNA. It doesn't technically contain cells, so that's kind of an interesting case study, viruses. All right, so now let's get more into what makes a plant a plant. What makes a plant different from an animal or a fungus per se. All right, so the plant kingdom is one of the kingdoms of life. So we have the kingdom Plantae, we have the kingdom Animalia, kingdom Fungi, as well as bacteria and archaea. So all plants are multicellular. That's a key point. So essentially a bacteria is always going to be single-celled or unicellular, only one cell. Plants always have multiple cells. Plants are always eukaryotic, meaning that their cells are bound in a nucleus. Their cells contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. The nucleus, as you might recall from biology, contains all of the cell's genetic information, which in plants is always going to be DNA. And those membrane-bound organelles could be like the cytoplasm is like the fluid of the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum is like the hardware store that fixes a lot of stuff. The chloroplast in plants is what actually takes in light energy and turns it into chemical energy. We'll talk more about that in photosynthesis. All plants perform photosynthesis, or I shouldn't say all plants, because there are technically a few exceptions. In science, you'd be very hard pressed to say all for really anything, because there tends to be one or two exceptions. The overwhelming majority, 99.999% of plants perform photosynthesis, which if you break down that word photo means light. The word photon is like a packet of light, so think of like a ball of light. So photo, light, synthesis, to create or synthesize. So light creation is kind of like the roots broken down. It's the process that plants use to capture sun's energy, and they take in carbon dioxide from the air and they produce oxygen and sugars. So we would have no oxygen or very, very little oxygen on the planet Earth today without photosynthesizers, plants and blue-green algae. It's actually pretty interesting because about 3 billion years ago, the Earth had very little oxygen on it. And then these little bacteria called cyanobacteria, they're named cyano because they were kind of a light bluish color. You might have heard of cyan, the color. Essentially, they created a lot of the world's oxygen. Oxygen used to be toxic to things, but it is essential to things now, and plants keep producing that oxygen. So it's really important to have plants in this world, give us clean air to breathe. All right, photosynthesis is what separates plants from animals and fungi, as well as a couple other things. So they contain chloroplasts, which allows them to do photosynthesis. Their cell structure is different. It's much more rigid, and then they contain different proteins like cellulose than animal cells would. but we'll get more into that as we go forward. All right, so let's talk a little bit about propagation. So in class, we are going to be propagating or essentially using one plant to make clones of that plant and make more of that plant. We're going to be doing that throughout the semester, throughout the year. So if you're tuning in virtually at home, I'll be making demonstration videos of how you would do that. And if you have plants at home, feel free to try that out on your own. But it won't certainly be required. But those in class will be doing that throughout the semester. All right, so right here we have a plant called mother-in-law's plant, also called the snake plant. And what they've done here is they've taken leaf cuttings, which we're actually going to do in a demonstration soon. They cut the leaf, a bigger leaf, and then just plopped it in the soil, and you can grow new plants from that. So propagation in general is the process by which new plants grow from other pre-existing plants. It can come from a variety of sources, so you can propagate in a variety of ways. You can use seeds. So essentially, propagation is growth of a new plant that comes from any part of an old plant. So seeds would be propagation as well. So seeds, so if you just have a seed from, say, or like a pine cone that has seeds for a pine tree. Cuttings, which for the example of the mother-in-law's tongue plant, for many plants it's much easier to use like a cutting than it is to actually grow it from a seed. Seeds can be hard to come by. And then other plant parts, for example, so like leaf cuttings, you can use parts of the leaves, parts of the stem in certain plants as well can be used. And propagation can also refer to man-made or natural dispersal of seeds. So, for example, if you look at a dandelion and all the seeds that it contains in that fluffy white top, then those are spread or propagated via wind. They're dispersed by the wind, and that is what allows more dandelions to come up the next year. Or potentially a man-made dispersal. So like if I go ahead and rip open a bunch of milkweed pods, and I can show you what those are, but essentially it's a prairie plant, and it has this kind of, it's like a milky white, really fluffy substance that kind of feels like the texture of cotton. So if I were to open those pods and just carry them around and toss those seeds around, that would be a man-made dispersal, and I would be propagating milkweed. I actually used to do that at the nature center where I worked, because we wanted more milkweed, which is it's a good plant that lives in Wisconsin, and we want more of it, because many things like monarch butterflies eat the milkweed. But that would be an example of propagation as well. All right, so at this point, we are going to end this mini lesson. We'll pick it up after our demonstration. There will be a separate demonstration video. All right, thanks for tuning in. And I gotta find the button to stop this.